The Meridian's kitchen exhaled steam like a creature barely contained. I moved through it with the precision of someone who'd memorized every corner, every station, every temperamental burner that liked to flare hotter on Thursdays. Tonight was Thursday. The executive chef barked orders in clipped sentences, barely acknowledging the servers who materialized with empty trays and left with full ones. I was one of many ghosts in this dance. 12 hours prior, I'd woken in the apartment I shared with my mother. The bedroom wasn't really a bedroom anymore. It was a medical station. Margaret lay in the adjustable hospital bed we'd rented 3 months ago, when it became clear she wouldn't be leaving it again. The cancer had opinions about her autonomy. Every morning I checked her medication schedule, adjusted the IV line, and counted backwards from 30 to keep myself from thinking too hard about hospital bills that accumulated like snow. Sam? Her voice from this morning had been papery, thin as the prescription bottles lined on the nightstand. "You're not going in today, right? You're staying?" I'd knelt beside the bed, smoothing the blanket across her chest. "Double shift," I told her, and I watched disappointment cross her face like a shadow. "But I'll be back by midnight. Mrs. Hernandez will check on you at 7. She'll bring soup." Margaret had closed her eyes, reorganizing her expression into acceptance. She'd learned not to fight my schedule. We both had. The difference was she was dying and I was just exhausted. A distinction that mattered in the morning and disappeared by evening. I spent the afternoon prepping the apartment, fresh water on the nightstand, the morphine measured out in case she needed it before Mrs. Hernandez arrived. Fresh linens, though I'd changed them yesterday. A paperback novel open on the edge of the bed, its pages dog-eared, unfinished like everything else in our lives seemed to be. Margaret dozed while I moved through these rituals, and I didn't wake her. Now, at the Meridian, I pivoted between tables with a tray of wine glasses balanced against my collarbone. The restaurant occupied the top floor of the Bennington building downtown, all floor-to-ceiling windows and tables that cost more than my monthly rent to outfit. The clientele reflected this. Old money, new money, the kind of people who ordered wine by vintage and left nothing on their plates because they'd learned efficiency from birth. They dressed in variations of black and gray, colors that suggested both sophistication and the absence of joy. I didn't blend into this world. I wasn't supposed to. The uniform, black dress pants, white shirt, black apron, was designed to make servers invisible. It worked perfectly. I'd spent 4 hours in this dining room, and not a single customer had made eye contact. They looked through me the way you look through glass. The reservation under the name Rossi came at 8:47 p.m. I was refilling water glasses when the host escorted them to table 12, positioned near the window overlooking the city lights, strung like constellations across the downtown sprawl. 2 of them, a man and a small child. The child was pale, almost translucent in the low light. She wore a dress that cost 3 weeks of my wages, dark purple velvet with a collar that stood up like an accusation. Her hair was the color of expensive bourbon, braided with a ribbon that matched her dress perfectly. She moved like someone was constantly reminding her to move, hesitant, careful, as if the world might fracture if she took up too much space. The man was different in every observable way. He carried the weight of a room the moment he sat down, not because he was loud or demanding. He was neither. He was quiet in a way that made you notice the quiet, the way you notice silence in a place that should be full of sound. His hair was dark, styled back from a forehead that creased when he studied the menu with the focus of someone reading classified information. He wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored to fit his shoulders like an idea, like someone had asked the fabric what it wanted to be and it had answered. Frame this man as something dangerous. When he looked up, the overhead light caught his eyes. Brown, but the kind of brown that held stories you wouldn't want to hear. Below his left eye was a scar, thin as a penstroke, running from cheekbone almost to jaw. It didn't make him ugly. It made him memorable in a way that ugliness couldn't touch. It made him look like someone who'd survived something that should have killed him. The child stared at the menu, then at the window, then at her hands folded in her lap. She didn't move much. Didn't fidget the way most children did. She was composed in the way of children who'd learned young that their feelings were inconveniences. I approached their table, notepad ready. This was the part of my job that required invisibility and presence simultaneously. Be useful but unnoticed. efficient but unforgettable in your efficiency. Good evening. My name is Samantha. Can I start you with something to drink? The man barely glanced at me. His attention remained on the child, assessing something about her posture or breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, the kind of low that made you lean in involuntarily. Water, sparkling. The girl has juice. Orange. His accent was Italian, the kind that lived in the back of the throat and emerged like a decision. I nodded and moved away before he could dismiss me further, which he didn't, but might have. At the bar, I ordered the drinks from Marcus, who gave me the stare he always did when I worked his station. Marcus had opinions about my availability and schedule, none of which I'd asked for. I cut that off fast, returning to table 12 with the waters balanced like I was diffusing something explosive. The child was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears sliding down her face while her hands remained folded in her lap, as though she'd decided to let her eyes betray her emotions, but nothing else would. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The man didn't respond to it immediately. He sat with his shoulders straight, studying the wine list, letting her cry the way someone lets a storm pass through a room. Not cruel, just distant, like he'd learned that stopping her tears with comfort only taught her to cry harder, and harder was something he couldn't permit. I set the drinks down carefully. Are you ready to order, or do you need another moment? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt it the way you feel a sudden temperature drop. Not unpleasant, just noticeable. Present, real in a way the rest of my evening hadn't been. Give us 5 minutes, he said. The child reached for her juice and took a sip, the tears still moving silently down her cheeks. She was 6, maybe 7, young enough to still believe tears solved things, old enough to know they didn't. She set the glass down with both hands, concentrating on the task like it required her full intelligence. I left them, but I kept track of table 12 the way you keep track of anything that disrupts the pattern. The man ordered the branzino. The child picked at bread and eventually ate half a plate of pasta, pushing the remainder to the edge of her plate in a careful line. He spoke to her occasionally, brief statements that seemed to require no response. Eat. Sit up. Stop staring. Each command delivered flatly, without cruelty, but without warmth either. By the time I brought their check, it was past 11. The kitchen had started its closing procedures. Half the tables sat empty. The man read the bill and didn't flinch. He pulled out a credit card, no wallet, just the card, and handed it to me. Keep the change, he said. I didn't look at the total until I processed it. $300, and that was before the tip. The charge went through without incident, and when I returned the card, his fingers brushed mine across the leather folder. It was accidental, or it wasn't. Either way, it lasted less than a second, but I felt it like a static shock, contained and electric. He looked at me differently after that. Not more interested, but differently, like I'd become a variable he was filing away for future reference. The way you file away a name or a face that might matter later. The child watched me with her wet eyes as they stood to leave. She grabbed his hand, and he let her, which seemed to cost him something in terms of posture or breath. They moved toward the elevator together, the child's dress brushing against his leg, and then they were gone, swallowed by the building's mechanics. I finished my shift at 12:15 a.m. The walk to my car took 7 minutes through downtown streets that were beginning to empty. The drive to the apartment in the older neighborhood took another 12. I climbed the stairs quietly, used my key like I was breaking in, and pushed open the bedroom door where Margaret lay in the dark, awake. "How was work?" she asked, her voice careful in the way of people who don't want to demand too much. "Busy. Good tips." I didn't mention the man or the child or the accident of his fingers against mine. Some things lived better in silence. I settled onto the edge of her bed, feeling every hour I'd stood collapse into my legs, like they'd been holding up far more than just my body. Margaret reached out and squeezed my hand, and for a moment we just sat like that, her fingers thin and warm and anchoring me to something true. "I had Mrs. Hernandez give me my evening medication," she said quietly. "It's helping with the pain." My stomach seized at the word pain, because it meant she was still experiencing it, which meant the medication wasn't helping as much as she wanted it to, which meant Blackwell Hospital, the one that took our insurance and had real palliative care specialists, was still impossibly far away. Financially impossible. The kind of impossible that kept me working doubles. "That's good, Mom." She squeezed my hand again and let go, turning her face back toward the window where the streetlight threw her profile into relief. Gray hair spread across the pillow, face that had held me when I was born, held strength when I needed it, held patience now in a way that broke something in my chest every time I looked at it. I stayed until her breathing evened out into sleep. Then I went to shower off the smell of kitchen grease and wine, off the invisible weight of being unseen. The hot water ran out before I finished, so I ended with cold that shocked my system awake, and I stood there shivering, thinking about nothing because thinking hurt worse than the cold. By 1:45 a.m., I was back in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, and thinking about bills and cancer and the way a man's fingers had felt against mine for less than a second. I thought about the child's tears and her composure and the scar on his face. I thought about how some people moved through the world like it had to accommodate them, like there was never any question they belonged. By 2:10 a.m., I was asleep, and the man at table 12 lived in the back of my mind like something I couldn't quite remember but refused to forget. The next evening arrived like an obligation I couldn't refuse. I showed up at the Meridian at 5 p.m., 20 minutes before service, and clocked in with the mechanical numbness of someone who'd performed this ritual 1,000 times. Margaret had been sleeping when I left the apartment, her breathing shallow but steady. Mrs. Hernandez was arriving at 6 to sit with her, which meant I could work without the constant pressure of wondering if she needed me in that moment. This was progress we'd learned to celebrate quietly, in the spaces between worry. The kitchen was already in motion when I tied my apron. The executive chef called out prep assignments with the staccato precision of someone who'd been giving orders for 20 years. Plates came and went. By 7 o'clock, the first wave of diners began arriving, couples holding hands across tables they'd reserved weeks in advance, small business groups talking about quarterly reports and fiscal projections, people with reservations and reasons to be somewhere specific. I moved through it all with the efficiency of practice, delivering wine to those who'd memorized their preferences, water to those who didn't care, recommendations about the specials that rotated based on what the supplier had delivered that morning. It was just past 8 when I noticed them again. The reservation appeared in the system like a name written on a contract I hadn't signed. Same name, Rossi. I was tying the knot in a fresh round of napkins when the host brought them to a different table this time, near the kitchen, away from the windows. The child wore emerald green tonight, a dress that made her pale skin look even more translucent. Her hair was loose, falling down her back in waves that suggested someone had spent time with a brush that morning, caring about details. She kept reaching up to tuck it behind her ear compulsively, as though the weight of it was too much to bear. Franco looked less contained than he had the previous night. His suit was navy, the kind of expensive that only expensive people recognized because they'd been taught to recognize it. But there was something tighter about his jaw. Something in the way he sat that suggested irritation had accumulated throughout his day like debt. His hands rested on the table with the kind of stillness that suggested control, effort, discipline. When he looked at the menu, he looked at it the way a general studies terrain before battle. I kept my distance initially, letting another server handle the initial greeting. But when I swung past their table with a tray of appetizers for nearby diners, I heard him order without consulting the child. His voice was low, the kind of low that made other conversations seem loud by comparison. "She'll have the pasta," he said. "Simple. Butter and salt only." Lucia was studying the menu like it held answers to questions she hadn't asked yet, like the listed items were clues to some larger mystery. Her fingers traced the descriptions, and I watched her lips move silently as though she was reading them to herself, conducting a private negotiation with the restaurant about what she might deserve. The evening moved along normally until around 9 o'clock. I was delivering their entrees when a manager named Richard appeared beside the table like an infection finding a wound. Richard was the type of manager who wielded his authority like a weapon he got paid to use, someone for whom the hierarchy of the restaurant was the only structure that made him feel substantial. His tie was too tight, his shirt pressed with the severity of someone trying to prove something. "Your daughter seems to be making quite a bit of noise," he said to Franco, gesturing vaguely toward Lucia, as though she was an inanimate object causing malfunction. "We have other guests." Lucia wasn't loud. She'd been sitting quietly for nearly 30 minutes, pushing pasta around her plate with the mechanical precision of someone performing the act of eating rather than actually consuming. She'd taken occasional sips of water, setting the glass down with both hands like it required concentration. She hadn't spoken above a whisper. She was 6 years old and had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. I felt something shift in the room. Not visibly. Nothing you could photograph or measure with instruments. Just a pressure change, like when a storm is building and the air becomes heavier before the rain comes, and you can feel it in your teeth. Franco set his fork down with deliberate precision. He didn't raise his voice. If anything, his voice became quieter, which was worse. Which was the kind of quiet that made the entire restaurant seem to hold its breath. "My daughter is not loud," he said. Each word landed separately, like stones dropped into still water. "Your service is subpar. Your wine list is pedestrian. Your kitchen has been inconsistent with the Brenzino for the past 6 months, but I have not complained." He paused, letting each word settle. "I will not be spoken to about my child. Not by you. Not by anyone in this restaurant. Not ever." Richard's face went red, a particular shade of red that suggested blood pressure rising, humiliation blooming. The realization that he'd made an error in judgment that was going to cost him. He opened his mouth to respond, but something in Franco's expression stopped him. Not a threat, exactly, but the suggestion that threats were a language he spoke fluently. Richard walked away without another word, his shoes squeaking against the floor in a way that seemed loud now, seemed accusatory. The table fell into silence. Lucia set down her fork carefully, the way you set down something precious that might break. Her eyes had filled with tears, but she wasn't crying yet, just preparing to, the way animals prepare before they run, gathering themselves for what was coming. I made a decision that was probably not mine to make. I approached the table with the intention of clearing plates, moving through the mechanics of my job like a person performing normalcy. But instead, I knelt down beside Lucia's chair, so my face was level with hers. The restaurant continued around us, voices and silverware and the hum of people eating. But right then it felt like just the 3 of us existed. That was very brave, I told her quietly. My voice was the kind of quiet you use for children, the kind that doesn't demand anything. The way you sat so still while your dad was talking. That takes real strength. Lucia looked at me with surprise, as though no one had ever given her credit for sitting quietly before, as though her ability to be still had never been recognized as anything but obedience. Her tears didn't fall, but they gathered on her lower lashes. "I'm scared," she whispered. I glanced at Franco. He was watching us with an expression I couldn't read, like his face was a locked door and I didn't have the key. His eyes had gone still, which was somehow more intense than any movement could have been. "Of what?" I asked Lucia. "That he'll be mad at me." Her voice was smaller than it should have been for a child of her size, like she'd learned to compress herself, to take up less space. "That I did something wrong." "He's not mad at you," I said. The certainty in my voice surprised me. "He was standing up for you. That means he loves you." Lucia considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher, turning the concept over in her mind like a stone she was examining for cracks. Her small fingers twisted together in her lap. Then she asked the question that would change everything, the one that emerged from her small mouth like she'd been holding it back for years, like it had been growing inside her and finally reached critical mass. "Are you my mommy?" The world stopped. Conversations continued around us, but I couldn't hear them. The kitchen continued operating, but I couldn't see it. Could only feel Franco's attention crash into me like a wave, like an acknowledgement of something that had just become real. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I said, "I'm someone who thinks you're very brave. Someone who thinks your dad did the right thing tonight, and someone who's glad you're here." It wasn't the answer she asked for, but it was the answer she needed. She reached out and took my hand, her small fingers cold from gripping her water glass. Her skin was soft in a way that made my throat tight, in a way that made me think about all the ways the world could hurt something this fragile. "What's your name?" she asked. Samantha. I'm Lucia. She said it like introduction was protocol she'd been taught to follow, like this was information I was supposed to have, and she was providing it with formal precision. This is my papa. He doesn't usually take me places. I stood, aware that I'd probably crossed a professional line I shouldn't have crossed, aware that I'd knelt down beside a child who wasn't mine and offered her something that looked like comfort. Franco was still watching me. His expression had shifted into something I couldn't parse. Not quite approval, but something that acknowledged what had just happened, that registered it as significant. Your daughter is lovely, I said to him, which was professional enough, which was the kind of statement a server was allowed to make. Can I bring you anything else? No. He paused. The pause stretched. Yes. Actually. He pulled out a business card from his jacket pocket. Just a card, nothing ornate or flashy. Cream-colored, thick stock, expensive paper. A phone number printed on it in raised lettering. No name, no company, nothing but digits and area code, nothing but geography. He slid it across the table toward me with the precision of someone making a gesture that had been carefully calculated. In case you ever need anything, he said quietly. His eyes held mine for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Anything at all? I took it without quite understanding why, without quite understanding what I was holding or what it meant. His fingers didn't brush mine this time. The transaction was clinical, deliberate, separated by space and intention. But something had shifted between us. Some acknowledgement that I'd witnessed something, that I'd responded to it in a way that mattered, that I mattered, at least in that moment, to him. By the end of the evening, they'd left. The card was in my apron pocket, burning like evidence of something I couldn't name. I didn't look at the number until I was home, at 1:30 a.m., sitting on the edge of Margaret's bed while she slept, my thumb tracing the raised lettering like it was Braille, like I could read meaning through touch. Who's that from? Margaret's voice emerged from the darkness, and I startled so badly I nearly dropped the card. I thought she was sleeping, had been sleeping for hours, had been breathing the shallow breaths of someone deep in pharmaceutical rest. But her eyes open, looking directly at me. I thought you were sleeping. I was. Then I heard you come in. She shifted, trying to sit up, and I helped her, adjusting the pillows behind her. Whose card is that? A customer's. A man? Yes. Margaret smiled in a way that suggested understanding something I hadn't told her, something I wasn't even sure I understood myself. You should call him. I didn't answer because I didn't know what I was holding, or why, or what it meant that I couldn't seem to put it down. The card felt heavier than paper should feel. The phone number seemed to pulse like something living, something that would change things if I acknowledged it, if I dialed it, if I let the voice on the other end pull me further into whatever this was becoming. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon. I was restocking wine glasses in the storage room behind the kitchen when Marcus found me, holding the restaurant's landline with an expression that suggested he couldn't quite believe what he was about to tell me. Someone's asking for you, he said. Won't say who. I took the phone, confused. Customers didn't ask for servers by name. Staff called servers when they were needed on the floor. This was something else entirely. Hello? I said. Ms. Cole. The voice was immediately recognizable. Franco. His accent wrapped around my name like it was something precious. Are you working tonight? My heart did something irregular. Yes, until closing. I'll be coming in for dinner, around 8. He paused. The pause seemed intentional, seemed designed to make me anticipate something I couldn't quite name. I'd like to speak with you. After your shift. Is something wrong? Did Lucia? Nothing's wrong. We simply need to talk. In private. The line went dead. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of agitation that made my movements jerky and imprecise. I spilled wine on a tablecloth. I forgot to deliver water to a foretop. I caught my reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel surfaces and barely recognized the nervous woman looking back. By 7:45, my hands were trembling enough that I switched to bus work instead of serving, anything to avoid being visible. Franco arrived at 8 exactly. This time he was alone. He wore charcoal again, a different suit, same cut, same precision. He sat at table 4, ordered a drink he didn't touch, and waited. His eyes kept drifting toward wherever I was in the restaurant. Not obviously. Just enough for me to notice. I finished my shift at 11:30 p.m. The kitchen shut down. Other servers clocked out and disappeared into the night. The restaurant emptied until it was just the closing staff and Franco, still sitting at his table, reading something on his phone. When I approached to ask if he needed anything else, he looked up and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. It wasn't rude. It was just a statement. A request that didn't really allow for refusal. I sat. "How much does your mother's treatment cost?" he asked without preamble. The question was so direct that I couldn't quite process it. "I'm sorry?" "Blackwell Hospital. The palliative care wing. Comprehensive cancer treatment protocol. How much?" I stared at him. "I don't understand why you're asking." "Because I'm wondering how you afford it. Based on the shifts you work here, based on the apartment building where you likely live, based on the shoes you're wearing, which are 2 years old and resoled twice. I'm guessing you don't afford it. You're probably not affording it at all. You're probably drowning in debt while your mother drowns in pain, because Blackwell is expensive, and your insurance is inadequate." The precision of his assessment was terrifying. He'd somehow deduced the entirety of my financial situation from observation alone. I thought about lying, about claiming we were fine, about shutting this conversation down. But Margaret's convulsions flashed through my mind, the morphine running out, the medication that helped but not enough. 68,000, I heard myself say. For the full protocol. He nodded like this confirmed something he'd already calculated. "I'm going to offer you employment. I already work. You already work 3 jobs based on the bags under your eyes and the calluses on your hands. You work at the Meridian. You work somewhere else that requires early morning shifts. And you sit with your mother when you should be sleeping." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a position as house manager, administratrice domestica, in my home. I don't understand what that means. It means you manage my household. You handle logistics, scheduling, staffing, supplies. You handle my daughter's care during the hours I'm otherwise occupied. It's vague because the role is flexible. It's whatever needs to be done. I can't. The salary is $8,000 per month." He waited for that to land. "Additionally, your mother receives immediate transfer to Blackwell Hospital. All costs covered. Full treatment protocol. Complete palliative care through whatever recovery or end-stage care she requires. Complete." The number was so large that it didn't feel real. $8,000. Every month. Margaret's treatment covered. Complete. "Why?" I asked. "Because you were kind to my daughter when you didn't have to be. Because you didn't flinch from me. And because I need someone in my home who won't betray me." The implication hung between us. This wasn't a normal job offer. This was a transaction with terms I didn't fully understand. A man like him, and I was beginning to understand that he was a particular kind of man, a dangerous kind, didn't offer this much money without expecting something significant in return. "What's the catch?" I asked. "Discretion. Complete discretion about my life, my home, my family. Privacy about everything you see and hear. In exchange, you have security. Your mother has medical care. You have a salary that makes your life bearable instead of destroying you." He looked at me directly. "I keep my people safe. As long as you're mine, nothing touches you." The phrase, "as long as you're mine," should have terrified me. Instead, it triggered something like relief. The idea that I could stop fighting alone. That someone with resources could take the weight I'd been carrying. "How long?" I asked. "However long is necessary. And if I say no, then we forget this conversation. I'll stop coming to the Meridian. I'll find another restaurant. You go back to your mother dying slowly while you work yourself into an early grave trying to keep her alive." It wasn't a threat exactly. It was just the truth stated plainly. The alternative to his offer was exactly what I was already doing, just slower. When would I start? Monday. I didn't say yes. I said, "I'll think about it." He wrote down an address on the back of a receipt. "If you decide to accept, be here Monday at 2 p.m. Bring whatever you need to live. Bring your mother's medical records. Bring yourself. Everything else becomes my responsibility." He stood and left a credit card on the table without looking at the bill. I sat there alone in the closing restaurant, holding a receipt with an address and an offer that would change everything. The weekend passed like a hallucination. I told Margaret what had happened, leaving out the parts that sounded insane and emphasizing the parts that sounded like salvation. She cried. Then she held my hand and said, "Do it." Sunday night I packed a suitcase with clothes for someone else's house, someone else's life. Margaret hugged me from the bed, and I felt her bones like bird bones, fragile and precious. "You're going to be okay," I told her. "You're going to be okay," she corrected me. Monday arrived cloudy and strange. I drove toward the address Franco had given me, away from downtown toward the older estates where rich people lived quietly behind walls. The mansion appeared suddenly, surrounded by gates and cameras, and the kind of security that suggested someone inside needed protecting, or wanted privacy desperately. I left an envelope and a note for Mrs. Hernandez on our kitchen table. 2 months of her rent, and a thank you written badly and honestly, because kindness should have a receipt, even when it's the only thing that never asks for one. I sat in my car for 5 minutes, my hands on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Then I opened the door and stepped into whatever came next. The mansion revealed itself in stages, like a story being told piece by piece. First the gates, which opened at Franco's approach like an acknowledgement of ownership. Then the drive, circular and lined with hedges trimmed so precisely they looked artificial. Then the house itself, which was too large to process all at once. I stood on the front steps with my single suitcase and felt the weight of stepping into a life that wasn't mine, but had somehow become my responsibility. A woman opened the door before I could knock. She was 60, maybe older, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it made her eyes narrower. She wore a black dress that suggested she'd been dressed for this occupation my entire life. Her expression suggested the opposite. "You must be Samantha," she said, and the way she said it sounded like an accusation wrapped in civility. "Yes. You're Signora Vittoria?" "I am." She stepped aside to let me in, but barely. I had to slip past her like I was trespassing, like her body was a door that opened grudgingly. "I've been managing this household for 17 years, since before Mr. Ravellini's wife died. I suspect I'll continue to manage it after you leave." The implication was clear. I wasn't permanent. I was temporary. I was an experiment that would inevitably fail. The entryway was all marble and high ceilings, the kind of space designed to make you feel small and unworthy. Paintings hung on the walls. Not modern art, but classical pieces. Landscapes and portraits of people who looked like they'd been dead for centuries, staring down at me with the judgment of ancestors. Everything was immaculate in a way that suggested no one actually lived here, that this was a museum someone occasionally passed through to demonstrate their wealth. "Let me show you to your room," Vittoria said, and began walking without waiting to see if I followed. Her heels clicked against the marble in a rhythm that sounded like judgment. The stairs were wide and lined with dark wood railings, polished to a shine that reflected the light like water. My suitcase felt heavier with each step, as though the climb itself was testing my right to be here. We moved through corridors that all looked identical, past closed doors and windows that faced onto gardens I couldn't quite see clearly. When Vittoria finally stopped, she opened a door onto a room that was smaller than I expected, but still larger than my entire apartment. "This is the staff wing," she said, not bothering to hide her categorization of me. The room contained a twin bed with white linens, a small dresser, a window that overlooked the side gardens. "You'll take your meals in the kitchen unless Mr. Ravellini requests otherwise. You'll maintain your own quarters. You'll have Thursdays off, though I can't imagine where you'd go or what you'd do with your time." She waited for a response I didn't have, her fingers gripping the door frame like she was considering whether to close me in. "Lucia's room is through here." She opened a connecting door into a child's bedroom that looked like it belonged in a magazine designed for people with unlimited resources. Everything was white and cream, with toys arranged on shelves as though they'd been curated by someone with actual aesthetic training and nothing but time. A small bed with a lace canopy that looked like clouds, a dresser with a mirror surrounded by lights like an actress's vanity, photographs on the wall, one of a woman with Lucia's hair and Franco's eyes, a portrait of happiness from another era, from a time before everything changed. "That was her mother," Vittoria said without being asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been protecting a memorial. Teresa. She decorated this room herself when she was pregnant. It's not to be altered. Nothing here is to be altered. I understood what she wasn't saying. I was here to care for Lucia, but Lucia belonged to Teresa's memory. I was a temporary replacement for something irreplaceable. I was furniture, essentially. Necessary but not permanent. By that evening, everything was arranged. Margaret had been admitted to Blackwell Hospital's private palliative care wing. Franco had apparently called ahead, had made arrangements that required no effort on my part. When I called the hospital from the mansion's kitchen telephone, they told me she was comfortable, that she'd been given new medications, that her pain was being managed better than it had been in months. I nearly cried hearing that. The relief was so intense it felt like weakness. Lucia arrived home from school at 3 p.m. the next day. I heard her before I saw her. A small voice calling out in the way children do when they're testing whether anyone's listening, whether the world is paying attention to their arrival. Vittoria had instructed me to present myself in the kitchen during the child's transition time, that Lucia would become accustomed to my presence naturally, as though I was a medication she'd eventually adjust to. The girl stopped when she saw me. Her school uniform was impeccable, tiny blazer and pleated skirt, leather shoes polished to a shine. Her hair was braided differently than before, more tightly, by someone who knew the structure of her head intimately. She looked smaller here in her own home than she had at the restaurant, more fragile. "Are you staying?" she asked. Not hostile, just assessing. "I work here now," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm going to help take care of you during the day." She studied me like I was a test she was taking, like my answer would determine something crucial. Then she turned and walked away without another word, her school bag dragging slightly behind her. Vittoria appeared as though on cue. She needs a snack, something light. She doesn't like chocolate. She paused. She doesn't like many things. The first 3 days were a study in rejection that hurt more than I expected it to. Lucia avoided me actively, deliberately, with the precision of someone who'd been rejected enough to know how to distribute the pain. When I offered her a snack, she said she wasn't hungry, and I watched her go hungry for the next 2 hours before she raided the refrigerator herself. When I tried to help her with homework, she said she could do it herself, and she sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, struggling with a math problem she'd solved in 5 minutes once I left the room. When I attempted to draw her into conversation, she answered only with yes or no, her voice small and focused somewhere past me, somewhere into the middle distance. I didn't push. Vittoria had warned me about this in her own hostile way, had made it sound like a character flaw rather than a trauma response. She tests people. She lost her mother 3 years ago. She doesn't trust easily. Some children never recover from that kind of loss. What Vittoria didn't mention was how much it hurt to be rejected by a child who had every reason to reject me, who was right to protect herself. I spent the evenings in my room reading, listening to the sounds of the house settle around me like a living thing. Franco was absent entirely during the day, visible only through the evidence of his occupation. Phone calls at odd hours that I heard from distant rooms, men arriving through side entrances in the afternoon, conversations conducted in rapid Italian behind closed doors that I wasn't meant to hear. On the 3rd night, after I'd put Lucia to bed and she'd closed the connecting door deliberately between her room and mine, Franco appeared in the kitchen where I was cleaning up after dinner. He wore a charcoal sweater, and there was something exhausted in the set of his shoulders, something that suggested the day had cost him significantly. His hair was slightly disheveled, and I realized I'd never seen him anything but perfectly put together before this moment. "How's it going?" he asked. And the question was casual enough, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "Fine. She's adjusting. She doesn't like you." I set down the plate I'd been washing. The water was cooling around my hands, turning lukewarm. "Not yet, but she will." He didn't respond to that immediately. Instead, he moved to the liquor cabinet and poured himself whiskey from a bottle that probably cost more than my car. "Do you want some?" I should have said no. The professional answer was no. The correct boundary was no. But there was something in the way he asked that made me understand he needed someone to sit with him. And the offering was just the mechanism, the excuse. "Okay," I said. He poured a second glass and handed it to me. We stood there, Not quite sitting, not quite standing. The kitchen was too bright for this kind of moment. Fluorescent lights making everything clinical, but he didn't turn them off. "Her mother used to be here," he said eventually. His voice different when he spoke English in private. Less accented, more vulnerable. In this kitchen, she'd cook things, even though we had staff, even though it didn't make sense. She said cooking was how she thought, how she worked through problems. He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. She died on the highway, 3 years ago, next month. A drunk driver hit her at an intersection. She was 41 years old. She had so much left to do. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Silence seemed like the right response. Lucia was 3. She barely remembers her. She has photographs and stories and a room that can't change, but she barely remembers the actual woman. He looked at the whiskey. She's tests everyone because she's looking for her mother in each person. When she doesn't find her, when she realizes that no one is going to be Teresa, she retreats. She'll find what she needs, I said quietly. Not her mother. Something else. But something. He nodded like he believed it or wanted to. We finished the whiskey in silence, and when he left through the kitchen door, something had shifted. I was no longer temporary in his mind. I was possibility. That night, around midnight, I woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't my own. Lucia was standing beside the bed like a ghost, like she'd materialized from nowhere. In the darkness, I could barely see her, just the outline of her small body in her pajamas. "Can I sleep here?" she asked, and her voice was so small it barely registered as sound. I moved to the wall without answering and held open the blanket. She climbed in, small and warm and tentative, her body rigid at first, like she was testing whether I would reject her the way she'd rejected me. Within minutes, she relaxed, her breathing evening out into sleep. I lay there thinking about mothers and replacements, and all the ways love bends to fit the shapes of our need, the way we search for what we've lost in the faces of strangers, hoping they might contain some fragment of what we're missing. 3 weeks passed in a way that made time feel unreal. I stopped counting days by calendar and started counting them by Lucia's changes, the small shifts in how she moved through the mansion, how her hand reached for mine without asking permission first. The first marked shift came on day 5. Lucia had scraped her knee falling on the stone tiles near the garden entrance. She came to me crying. Not the silent tears of before, but actual sobs, her small body shaking with the weight of a scraped knee that had broken something in her resolve. I cleaned the wound carefully, applied antiseptic, covered it with a bandage she'd chosen herself from a box Vittoria kept in the kitchen. When it was done, she'd climbed onto my lap and stayed there for an hour, her breathing gradually slowing into something closer to peace. Vittoria had watched from the kitchen doorway. When our eyes met, something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance exactly, but acknowledgement that perhaps I wasn't entirely useless. Margaret was improving at Blackwell. When I visited her on my day off, she looked more present than she had in months. The pain medication was working better. The specialized palliative care team had adjusted her treatment protocol. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost, and though her hair remained thin from the cancer's progression, her eyes held something like hope again. "Tell me about the house," she'd asked during one visit, sitting up in her private hospital room that Franco had somehow arranged to be positioned with a view of gardens. "It's beautiful," I'd said. "Old money beautiful. Everything is exactly where it should be. And the girl? She's starting to trust me." Margaret had smiled, and it was the smile of someone who understood more than I'd told her. "You're going to be okay. Both of you." By the end of the second week, Lucia had begun seeking me out. She'd find me in the morning and take my hand without speaking. We'd walk through the mansion together, and she'd show me things. A painting of a woman who looked like her mother, a piano in a room no one used, a garden where her mother used to sit. Each item was a piece of her history she was deciding to share with me. Each gesture, a small trust. "My mama used to sing," Lucia said one afternoon as we sat in the garden room, the one with the piano that no one played. "What did she sing?" I asked. "Lullabies. I remember one. She hummed a melody, something Italian and soft, and I realized she was trying to resurrect a memory from when she was 3 years old. trying to keep her mother alive through fragments. "Can you teach it to me?" I asked. She did. We sat there while she taught me a lullaby in Italian that I barely pronounced correctly. But she didn't correct me. She just watched me try, and something in her face relaxed. By week 3, she was calling me Mommy in her sleep. I'd wake to hear her say it softly, testing the word in dreams where she felt safe enough to want a mother. She never used it while awake, never made it official. But I heard it, and I understood what it meant. Signora Vittoria began leaving extra portions at dinner. She started greeting me with something approaching civility. When I asked for household supplies, she brought them without the suspicious expression she'd worn before. One afternoon, she actually smiled at something Lucia said, and her smile included me too. Franco's schedule began to shift. He was home more frequently in the afternoons, present during the hours when Lucia was awake and we were moving through our routines. I'd see him watching from doorways as I helped Lucia with her homework, as I braided her hair, as I corrected her posture at the dinner table without making her feel ashamed. His expression during these moments was complicated, something between observation and yearning. One evening, after Lucia had gone to sleep, I found him in the kitchen again. He was making the space feel smaller just by being in it. "You're good with her," he said. "She's easy to love." "No, she's not." He moved closer. "She's been difficult. She's been broken. She's tested every person who's tried to get close to her." He paused. "Until you. She just needed time. She needed someone who understood loss." He looked at me directly. "You've lost things too." I didn't answer because the answer was too personal. "Teresa was everything to me," he continued. And this was the first time he'd said her name like that. Like it mattered that I heard it. She was the one good thing in my life. She made me believe I could be more than what I am. He paused. "When she died, I thought that was the end of everything. I thought Lucia would never recover. I thought I would never recover." I waited. "But you're here." He said it like it was a surprise. Like my presence in this house had shifted something fundamental. "And Lucia is coming back to life, and I'm starting to remember what it felt like to want things beyond just survival." I stood up because I needed to move, because the weight of what he was saying was too much to process while sitting still. "I promised myself I wouldn't do this again," he said. "Wouldn't let anyone close. Wouldn't risk losing someone else." "You're not going to lose Lucia." "I'm not talking about Lucia." He looked at me, and his eyes held something that made my breath catch. "I'm talking about you." The moment stretched between us, unresolved, alive with possibility. "I should check on her," I said quietly. He nodded, and I could see him gathering himself back together, pulling the walls back into place. "Yes, you should." But something had changed. The evening had shifted something fundamental about what existed between us. By the next morning, I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the way he didn't quite look away as quickly, in the way Lucia noticed something had changed too, and held my hand a little tighter. Vittoria watched all of this with an expression that had transformed completely. Where there had been hostility, there was now something like understanding. She knew what was happening before anyone acknowledged it. She knew what Franco felt, what he was trying not to feel, what was becoming inevitable. One afternoon she pulled me aside while Lucia was at school. "He loved her very much," Vittoria said. "His wife. I watched him mourn her for 3 years. I know. I think," Vittoria continued, "that maybe his mourning is beginning to transform into something else. And maybe that's not a betrayal of what he had. Maybe that's healing." By the end of week 3, I'd stopped pretending this was a simple employment arrangement. I'd stopped telling myself it was just about Margaret's medical care, just about Lucia needing someone, just about the money. Something deeper had taken root, something that grew every time Franco looked at me, every time Lucia called me by a name that meant mother, every time Vittoria smiled instead of criticized. The calendar on the kitchen wall marked the days, but what mattered wasn't the passage of time anymore. What mattered was that I'd become essential to this household in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd become woven into their lives in a way that made leaving impossible. 4 weeks into my residence, the mansion changed. Not visibly at first, just a shift in the air. A tenseness that crept through the corridors like something breathing. The first sign was the security detail. Men I'd never seen before began appearing at the gates, positioned at corners of the property, with the kind of stance that suggested weaponry beneath their jackets. Cameras were installed in places that didn't need cameras. The gardens, the kitchen, even the hallway outside Lucia's room. Vittoria stopped commenting on them after I asked once. She just pursed her lips and continued with her work. Franco was home more frequently, but his presence felt different now. He moved through the mansion like someone conducting an orchestra only he could hear. Phone calls happened behind closed doors. Conversations in rapid Italian that I pretended not to notice. His jaw stayed clenched, the muscle there ticking constantly, like his teeth were grinding even when his mouth was closed. Lucia felt it too. She became clingy in a way that broke my heart, where before she'd been gaining confidence, testing the boundaries of her independence. Now she wanted me in her line of sight constantly. At school, she became withdrawn. Her teachers called Vittoria to report that she'd stopped raising her hand, that she sat quietly during activities, that something had shifted in her demeanor. "What's happening?" I asked Franco one evening. He was in the kitchen at 10 p.m., drinking coffee like it was water, staring at nothing. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Lucia's scared. She'll be fine. She won't be fine if you don't tell me what's going on." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. There was an attempt. Someone tried to infiltrate the property. Security stopped them before they got to the house, but the message was clear. Someone's testing boundaries. My stomach dropped. Who? The Cartel del Golfo. They've been pushing into territories that aren't theirs. This is reconnaissance. They're evaluating whether they can move against me. Can they? No. He said it with absolute certainty. But they don't know that yet. And while they're figuring it out, everyone in this house is at risk. I thought about Margaret at Blackwell Hospital. I thought about Lucia upstairs in her room, probably not sleeping, probably listening to the sounds of security movements through the house. I thought about what staying meant versus what leaving meant. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't thank me. He just nodded like he'd known all along that I wouldn't leave, and that knowledge seemed to settle something in him. The next morning, Lucia woke me at 5 a.m. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were puffy, like she'd been crying for hours in the dark. She climbed into my bed and didn't speak for a long time. We just lay there, her small body against mine, both of us listening to the sounds of the house waking up, the extra footsteps of security, the tension that had become part of the air we breathed. "Is Papa bad?" she asked eventually. "No, sweetheart. Your Papa is good. He protects people he loves. Is he going to die?" The question was so direct, so devastating in its simplicity, that I had to take a moment to respond. "No, he's not going to die. My mama died." "I know, but your Papa is very careful, and he has people protecting him, and he has you. He has us." She was quiet for a long time after that. Over the next 3 weeks, the security presence became normalized. It was still visible, still present, but it became part of the landscape of the house, the way furniture becomes invisible through familiarity. What changed was Franco's behavior. He began spending more time with Lucia, carving out moments between whatever operational security measures he was orchestrating. They'd have breakfast together. He'd help her with homework. He'd sit with her before bed, telling her stories about her mother in a voice that suggested grief transforming into something else. Not forgetting, but integrating. I watched him do this, and I realized that what we were building here wasn't just employment and convenience. It was something deeper. It was the beginning of family, the kind you choose rather than inherit. Margaret called from the hospital one afternoon. Her voice was stronger than it had been in months. "How are you, sweetheart?" she asked. "I'm fine, Mom. How are you?" "Better. Much better. The doctors say my last scans show improvement. Real improvement." She paused. "Are you safe?" "I've been thinking about you there, in that big house with all those people. I'm safe. We're safe. And the girl? She's good. She's healing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You love her?" "Yes." "And him?" I didn't answer immediately. "It's complicated. Love usually is," Margaret said softly. "But you deserve it, Sam." You deserve to have people in your life who matter. You deserve not to carry everything alone. After I hung up, I went to find Franco. He was in his study, the room I'd learned to recognize as his sanctuary. Maps on the walls, files on his desk, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in the criminal underworld that he never tried to hide from me. "My mother's improving," I said from the doorway. He looked up. "That's good. It's because of what you did. Getting her into Blackwell. The treatment. The specialists." I stepped inside and closed the door. "I want you to know that I see it, that I understand what you've given us. You don't owe me anything. I know, but I'm choosing to stay anyway. Not because of the money or the security or because I don't have another option. Because of Lucia. Because of—" I stopped, unable to find the words. "Because of me?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He stood and moved toward me, and the distance between us felt like it had weight, like it was something that needed to be crossed deliberately. When he reached me, his hand came up, his fingers brushing my cheek with the kind of gentleness that seemed impossible coming from someone who moved through the world with so much violence implied. "I promised myself I wouldn't let this happen again," he said. "After Teresa, I told myself love was too dangerous, too costly. Maybe it is," I said. "But we're doing it anyway." He kissed me then, and it was everything I'd been afraid of and hoping for simultaneously. It tasted like promise and risk, and the acknowledgement that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. When we pulled apart, Lucia was standing in the doorway. "Are you my mommy now?" she asked, and this time her voice wasn't tentative. It was a statement, a claim, something she'd decided and was announcing to the world. I looked at Franco. He looked at me. Then I knelt down in front of Lucia and said, "Yes, I am." She hugged me so hard it felt like she was trying to make sure I couldn't leave, couldn't disappear the way her other mother had. And I held her, and I understood that whether I'd meant to or not, whether I'd planned for it or it had simply happened, I'd become the thing she needed most. Family. The call came at 3 a.m. Franco's phone rang, and I heard him answer in rapid Italian, his voice shifting into something harder than I'd ever heard. The words were clipped, urgent, each one carrying weight I could feel even without understanding the language. I lay in the dark, listening to the tension in his words, trying to decipher meaning from tone alone. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes felt like hours. When he hung up, the silence that followed felt dangerous in a way I'd never experienced before. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the silence of a decision being made, of violence being set in motion, of a world reshaping itself around choices that couldn't be unmade. He came to my room without knocking. I was already awake, had been awake since the phone rang, my body attuned to the sound of his voice and what it meant. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hallway light, and something in his posture told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. "We're moving," he said. "Tonight." "What happened?" "Intelligence confirms what I suspected. Cartel del Golfo is planning a retrieval operation, direct assault on the property. They're coming for Lucia." My body went cold, every nerve ending suddenly aware of danger. "When?" "Dawn. Maybe sooner. Maybe they're already moving." He moved closer, his expression focused. "Operational. I have a safe location prepared. Bunker, reinforced, off the property. You and Lucia go there now. Vittoria will drive you. She knows the route. What about you? I have something to handle first." "Franco, this ends tonight," he said, and the finality in his voice made clear that arguing would be pointless. He'd already made the decision, had already committed to a path I couldn't see but could feel the consequences of. "I'm going to make absolutely certain they never think about touching my daughter again. I'm going to show them the cost of trying." He moved through the mansion like he was conducting a symphony only he could hear. Phone calls happened in rapid succession, each one a piece of an operation I couldn't fully comprehend. Men arrived through side entrances, coming from vehicles I heard arrive but didn't see. Conversations happened in rapid Italian that were too low for me to hear clearly, but I caught fragments. Names, accusations, betrayals uncovered, loyalty questioned. I learned later what he'd done. He'd had an insider within his own organization all along, Someone who reported directly to him about vulnerabilities, about which men were being approached by rival organizations, about financial pressures that made loyalty negotiable. When the cartel moved against him, Franco used that intelligence not to eliminate the traitors immediately, but to expose them to his own people first. He showed evidence of their betrayal. He revealed how much money they'd accepted, which promises they'd made, how comprehensively they'd prepared to betray the man who'd given them everything. The internal structure collapsed before the external threat could even materialize. Men turned against their compromised brothers. Loyalty reasserted itself through the violence of removing those who'd violated it. By the time dawn broke, the cartel's operation was already compromised at its foundation. Half their contacts within Franco's organization were gone. Their intelligence was useless. Their leverage had evaporated like morning fog. But Franco had moved us first anyway, just in case, because protection meant not taking any chances. Vittoria came to my room at 3:30 in the morning. She moved through the darkness like someone who'd done this before, who'd been prepared for this scenario for years. "Get dressed. Bring only what you can carry," she said. Her voice was different now, almost gentle in a way I'd never heard. "We leave in 5 minutes." I woke Lucia carefully, trying not to frighten her. She was groggy, confused, asking where we were going. I dressed her in warm clothes, packed her favorite book, and a stuffed animal she'd owned since before her mother died. I threw clothes into a bag for myself, then followed Vittoria through corridors that suddenly felt hostile, like the walls themselves were conspiring against us. Franco was in the entryway. He kissed Lucia on the top of her head, and I saw his hands tremble slightly as he held her. It was the first sign of weakness I'd witnessed from him, and it terrified me more than anything else. "Stay with Samantha," he told her. "Do everything she says. Be brave for me." "Papa, where are you going?" Lucia's voice was small and frightened. "I have to take care of something, but I'll be there soon. I promise." We drove through darkness. Vittoria didn't use the main roads. She took us through back routes, down progressively smaller roads that wound through forests I didn't recognize. The night seemed to stretch endlessly. Lucia fell asleep against my shoulder, her small body rising and falling with breath. I stayed awake, watching the darkness pass, feeling the weight of what was happening, the knowledge that men were probably dying right now because of choices Franco had made, because someone had threatened his daughter. The compound appeared suddenly after hours of driving. It was built into a hillside, disguised to look like nothing more than a storage facility from the outside. Weathered wood, faded paint, nothing to suggest the operational center it actually contained. We descended stairs that went down into the earth. The bunker opened up around us, state-of-the-art despite being hidden underground. Generators hummed softly. Water dispensers stood along one wall. Food supplies were stacked in organized sections. Communication systems lined a back room. "You stay here," Vittoria said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Mr. Ravellini will contact you when it's safe. Don't open the doors for anyone else. Don't leave." "Where is he?" I asked. "Where he needs to be." She kissed Lucia's forehead gently. "Don't worry. He will come back. He always does." She locked the doors behind her, and we were alone in the bunker, with nothing but time and fear. The safe site wasn't a random dot in the countryside. It sat on the outermost acreage of Franco's holdings, a place built to look forgettable and wired to funnel trouble away from the city. His people had seeded a false trail, license plate pings and staged convoy chatter, to lure any pursuers past the main estate and toward this perimeter, where ground and cameras favored us instead of them. If gunfire came, it would come here, at the edge, where distance could be measured and odds bent on purpose. Hours passed in a way that made time feel abstract. I kept Lucia distracted with books and games, with stories and drawings, with anything I could use to keep her from asking questions I didn't have answers to. I made her eat the sandwiches Vittoria had left. I made her drink water. I kept my hands steady when internally I was fracturing with worry. Around noon, gunfire erupted somewhere outside. It was distant, controlled, but unmistakable. The sound was muffled by earth and reinforced walls, but I heard it. Lucia heard it too. Her body went rigid against mine. "What is that?" she asked. "Your papa protecting us," I said. And it was the truth, even if the truth was horrifying. The firing lasted perhaps 30 minutes, controlled bursts that suggested organization, discipline, purpose. Then silence returned, heavier than before, weighted with finality. I held Lucia and tried to look calm while my heart was doing something irregular, something dangerous in my chest. The silence felt worse than the shooting. The silence meant the violence was over, but I didn't know who had survived it. Franco appeared at the bunker entrance an hour later. He was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder, his shirt torn and soaked through with dark red that had turned brown at the edges. His face was calm, but his eyes held something sharp and bright, something that had just crossed through fire and come out the other side transformed. Lucia saw him and broke away from me without hesitation, running toward him. He swept her up carefully, keeping his injured side away from her, and held her like she was the only real thing in the world, the only point of reference worth keeping. When he looked at me over her head, I saw the obsession I'd felt from him before, but transformed now into something fiercer. It wasn't possession anymore. It was protection. It was claim. It was love expressed through violence and sacrifice. "It's over," he said. His voice was hoarse. "They're gone. All of it ends here. No one's coming back." I moved toward him, toward the wound on his shoulder. "You're hurt. It's nothing." "It's not nothing." I began carefully removing his shirt, examining the wound. It was deep but not catastrophic. The bullet had grazed through muscle, creating a channel of damage but missing vital structures. The bleeding had slowed. I'd worked in restaurants for years, but before that I'd taken nursing courses, had learned basic wound care in case of kitchen emergencies. I cleaned it with supplies from the bunker's first aid kit. I bandaged it with precision. And I didn't ask him about the cost, about how many people had died to ensure Lucia was safe, about what he'd done to destroy the threat. Those were questions for later, if ever. "I'm sorry," he said. "I brought danger to you both." I looked at him directly, and I meant every word. "You also eliminated it. You protected us. But you shouldn't have had to be protected. I chose to be here," I said. "I chose you. I chose Lucia. That means I chose all of this." He kissed me then, blood and danger, and everything else falling away until there was only the connection between us. The acknowledgement that we'd survived something and come out the other side still bound together, still intact. Lucia fell asleep between us that night in the bunker, her small body rising and falling with breath, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Franco's arm stayed around both of us, his injured shoulder propped carefully on pillows he'd arranged around himself. The three of us existed in the artificial light of the bunker, like we were the last people on Earth. 3 days, he said quietly, his voice rough from the violence he'd orchestrated. "In 3 days it's safe to return to the mansion. The authorities have been handled through channels I've spent years establishing." He wasn't boasting. He was outlining a containment protocol. Paperwork waited where it needed to wait, and the people who needed to see it would see it. Just enough, just in time, leaving no one with reason to act theatrically when a quiet signature would do. "The cartel is fractured beyond repair. My people understand there are consequences for betrayal." I didn't ask what those consequences looked like. I didn't need to know the specifics. The knowledge that he'd protected his daughter was enough. "We go home," he continued. "All of us. Together. And this time, nothing touches what's mine. No one gets close enough to threaten. No one." He said it like a vow, like a promise carved into something permanent. And I believed him completely, because he'd just proven it to me through fire and blood. 6 weeks after leaving the bunker, the mansion had transformed into something I would never have anticipated on that first day, when Vittoria led me through its corridors with hostility written into every gesture. The walls hadn't changed. The marble was still cold beneath my feet. The paintings still hung with their centuries of judgment, but the space itself had become something different. It had become home. Lucia was officially calling me Mommy now. Not tentatively, not in her sleep, but loudly and with certainty, announcing it to Vittoria, to the household staff, to anyone who entered our orbit. Franco had stopped resisting it somewhere around week 3 of our return. I'd watched the moment it happened. He was watching Lucia braid my hair in the garden room, and something in his face had reorganized itself. The internal struggle had ceased. He'd accepted that loving me and honoring Teresa's memory weren't mutually exclusive. That moving forward didn't mean forgetting. Margaret had been transferred from Blackwell Hospital to a private suite on the second floor of the mansion. Franco had arranged it without asking my permission, had simply decided that my mother belonged in the family home, and so she was moved. The room had windows overlooking the gardens. The medical equipment was state-of-the-art, but positioned to be unobtrusive. Nurses came daily to monitor her condition, adjust her medications, ensure her comfort. She'd gained weight. Her skin had color again. She'd started reading novels instead of just staring at walls. "This is surreal," she'd said to me one afternoon, sitting in an armchair by the window with tea cooling on the side table. "A month ago, I thought I was dying in a public hospital on a Grant Hospital bed. You were dying," I said gently. "Now I'm living, in a mansion, in the home of a criminal." She said it matter-of-factly. "Is that what this is?" "He's a lot of things," I said. "Criminal is one. But he's also the man who's keeping you alive. He's the man who loves his daughter. He's the man who's building a family." Margaret had smiled then. And it was the smile of someone who understood that love operated in territories most people didn't venture into. That sometimes the people who saved you came from unexpected places, moved through the world in ways that society condemned, but their capacity for devotion was no less real. The household staff had adjusted to the new structure. Vittoria now treated me with something approaching warmth. She asked my opinions about household decisions. She brought me coffee in the mornings without being asked. She'd begun teaching Lucia traditional Italian recipes, and I'd watch the two of them in the kitchen together, and Lucia would look up at me with pride when she'd successfully made pasta from scratch. Vittoria was creating continuity, weaving my mother into the family narrative, ensuring that we all understood ourselves as a unit, rather than as separate people occupying the same space. Franco had called me into his study one afternoon. I'd expected conversations in that room to be about business, about the criminal operations that continued to run with the kind of precision that suggested his brief absence hadn't disrupted anything. Instead, he'd pulled out a document that looked official enough to be binding. "I want to formalize your position here," he said, "not as an employee, as family." I didn't understand at first what he was showing me. It was a contract of sorts, but not a standard legal document. It was written in both Italian and English, and it established that I was authorized guardian of Lucia in the event of his death, that I had decision-making authority regarding her education, her medical care, her welfare, that Margaret was established as a dependent with all medical expenses and living expenses covered permanently. "You don't have to sign it," he said, "but I want you to know that you're not temporary, that you're written into this life legally, financially, structurally." I signed it without reading every word carefully. I knew what it meant. It meant I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. It meant I was bound here through more than just emotion. It meant Lucia was legally mine now in all the ways that mattered. That night, I'd told Margaret about it. She'd cried, the tears coming suddenly and completely, and I'd held her while she processed what my acceptance meant. Her daughter wasn't just safe anymore. Her daughter was permanent. Her daughter had claim. The first real family dinner happened 6 weeks after our return. All of us seated at the dining room table, Franco at the head, me beside him with Lucia on my other side, Margaret across from me looking stronger than I'd seen her in years, Vittoria serving the food she'd helped Lucia prepare. We weren't pretending to be something we weren't. We were acknowledging what we had become. Franco raised a glass. "To family," he said. "Not the kind we're born into. The kind we choose." Lucia looked up from her plate. "Papa, are you saying Samantha is our family?" "Yes," he said. "Samantha is our family. Margaret is our family. Vittoria is our family. We are bound together." Lucia smiled, and it was the kind of smile that contained all the healing that had happened over the previous months. It contained acceptance of her mother's death and her mother's memory. It contained the beginning of a new era where she could be held by someone other than the woman who'd given birth to her. By night, Franco and I existed in a rhythm that had become its own kind of language. He would check on Lucia, would tuck her into bed, would read her a story about her mother that kept Teresa alive in narrative form. Then he would come to my room, and we would fall into patterns that were both intensely physical and profoundly domestic. He would trace the scar on my wrist from a childhood accident. I would trace the scar on his jaw that I'd stopped thinking of as disfiguring and started thinking of as proof of survival. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said one night, his fingers moving through my hair. "After Teresa died, I thought love was something I'd burned through. I thought I'd used up my allocation of happiness." "You're getting a second one," I said. "I'm getting a second one," he agreed. "With you, with Lucia, with the family we're building that defies every expectation I had about what my life would become." He kissed me then, and it was different from the early kisses that had carried the charge of transgression and obsession. This kiss carried the weight of routine, of certainty, of a man who'd decided I wasn't going anywhere and had built his life accordingly. In the mornings, Lucia would climb into bed between us. She'd been doing this for 2 weeks now, and Franco had stopped seeming surprised by it. He'd simply make space, his arm coming around both of us, and we'd exist in that configuration for an hour before the day demanded we get up. The day she asked if we were getting married, we both went still. "Do you want us to?" Franco asked. Lucia nodded seriously. "Everyone at school says their parents are married. I want to say you're married." He looked at me over her head. The question wasn't really about whether Lucia wanted us married. It was about whether I wanted this made legal, official, permanent, in ways that went beyond the contract he'd already had me sign. "Yes," I said. "I want to marry you." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he'd always known I would say yes, that the infrastructure of our family had been built on the assumption of permanence from the moment I'd arrived at the mansion. 3 months later, in a private ceremony that included only Margaret, Vittoria, Lucia, and Franco's most trusted men, I became Signora Ravellini. I wore a cream dress that Vittoria had helped me select. Franco wore charcoal, and when he slipped the ring on my finger, his hands were steady. Lucia threw flower petals, and she was crying happy tears, and Margaret was crying from her chair positioned at the side of the room where she could see everything, and Vittoria was nodding like this was exactly how things should have always been. The mansion had stopped being a place I worked and had become a place I belonged. The empire Franco controlled continued to operate, but from my perspective, it had become abstract, something that existed in the background of a life that was fundamentally about a family, a broken one initially, but remade into something whole.